Fortress on a Hill with Henry, Danny, Kagan, Giovanni, Shiloh, and Manisha.
Welcome, everyone, to Fortress on a Hill, a podcast about U.S. foreign policy, anti-imperialism, skepticism, and the American way of war. I'm Henry. My pronouns are he and him. Thank you for joining us today. With us today is my three fellow co-hosts, Giovanni, Shiloh, and Monisha. Good afternoon, guys. How are y'all feeling?
Feeling good. How are you?
Blink right, but I am here.
Oh, yeah. I'm here navigating, and with this Texas heat, we're like in the 110s. So, but we're doing good.
Yeah, it's been nasty lately, man. It's frustrating to see, especially with that legal change they had about water breaks, that construction workers in Texas weren't like insured to be able to have as like actual official water breaks. They were getting like 10 minutes every 4 hours or something just to consume water.
Wow.
That's wild.
So today we were going to just take a little bit of time and kind of introduce Shiloh and Monisha. We thought that the best way to do that would be to just kind of open the floor up and talk about what each of us is most passionate about within the anti-war movement. And just in the interest of giving everybody enough time, we're going to let Shiloh go first, but I'm sure Giovanni and I will have some useful nuggets to drop too. So Shiloh, please, can you tell us a bit about what you're passionate about in the anti-war movement?
Yeah, thank you for asking, and it's always so great to see the three of you. I'm passionate about so much in the anti-war movement, but I guess there's a couple of like sectors that I'm most passionate about because they impact me the most, I guess. And the first one would be like youth, so including young people in the anti-war movement. And I'm passionate about that because, my partner is a 3.5-year-old, and it just becomes like more and more real as the older they get, and seeing how much children and youth are just targeted for the war machine and from a very young age. And so definitely passionate about talking to kids at their level, whatever age they're at, about how to be anti-war and anti-militarist, and just notice like what's going on around them. And then the second part, the second thing I'm most passionate about within anti-war work is around like queer and trans folks, like just getting out of the grips of the military industrial complex, because it just like just really hounds our community and exploits how vulnerable of a community we are as queer and trans people. Some specifics just about like queer and trans people are largely overrepresented in the military because we are so vulnerable, right? We have a harder time accessing like healthcare and housing and security and job. And so the military swoops in to offer that to our community. And so I am passionate about making sure queer and trans folks aren't exploited within the military industrial complex.
You had mentioned about taking a recent activist trip with the kids going camping and stuff. I'm curious, what were the kind of topics that they were bringing up that kind of fit into what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so I recently went down to Southern California at this camping trip called Peace Camp. It's for all the youth in that area, and like Escondido, which is a really militarized Marine Corps heavy area. I was actually stationed down there for a while. And we took a bunch of kids who are in like peace clubs in their high schools and took them camping, and they all were camping for the first time. So that's a whole other thing where they're experiencing bugs and being away from their phones, and well, kind of away from their phones, and sleeping in a tent for the first time. But the experience was really wonderful. A lot of the kids, so they're already active in their peace club, but they had a lot of questions for me, for someone who was in the military and deployed, and they had a lot of like misconceptions of the military. So it was just like, yeah, ask me all your questions, because I guarantee if you've asked the recruiter, they're going to give you the wrong answer. They're going to lie to you. And I can just tell you from my experience, truthfully and honestly, answer your questions. So some of the things they asked me were just absurd, like, you know, a range of questions. Like, I heard that, you know, once you're in the military, like, you can get your citizenship is handled, and your whole family is taken care of, and you have health care for you and your family. It's like, no, that's not true. Let's break that down. So it ranged from that to like, you know, these are kids who have never been out of the big city of LA. So they had questions like, did you have to sleep outside and things like that.
Do you get any push from like any like gun ho kids? There's always one
Yeah, of
very
course.
gun ho, very, you know, very militaristic minded. You get any pushback, anything?
I was actually surprised too, but yeah, just I was surprised because it was a peace club. But I had to, like, you know, step back and be like, well, these are kids who are still seeking, you know, access to social movement and access to, you know, things that they can't have otherwise. And so yeah, there was one kiddo in particular that I'm thinking of, and he was thinking about joining the military, so that he could have health care and a job and move out of LA. And so we had some really good talks and discussions, and he asked me, you know, like, why do I think youth join the military? And I was like, well, it's not about why I think, like, why are you thinking about joining the military? And our reasons were the same, that he wanted to go to college, he wanted to live outside of his situation that he was in, you know, low income family and a tight living quarters. And it's like, yeah, that's why I joined the military too. And this was my experience. So you get to have that like hindsight conversation of like, I chose the military for the same reasons that you're thinking about it. I'm not saying your experience will be the same, but here's a person who went through this experience, and here's what happened to me. And I don't know that I changed his mind, but I at least opened his mind a little bit. Yeah.
And what would you, similar question, but in terms of queer and trans folks, in terms of them asking the same kind of questions, what I'm sure you would warn them in a very similar way. But in terms of the differences on that side, in terms of, like you mentioned about them, you know, being overrepresented in the military, already wanting to escape a bad situation of a bunch of different with a bunch of different variables, how would you warn them to be cognizant of that while acknowledging that they are overrepresented and are trying to escape in some way or another?
Yeah. That conversation is similar, but has a little bit of like added little twist to it. So I always try to I try to give kids like cold hard facts without being like, you know, overwhelming. But
Sure.
you know, one of the cold hard facts about the military, as we all know, is that military sexual trauma and and violence is rampant in the military, and that is exponentially increased if you're queer and trans. And so I really try to get that through to them and just talk to them about how the military is not a accepting, loving, caring rainbows place. Like, it doesn't matter if they start painting the tanks with rainbows. Like, it's not a kind or gentle place for anyone, and that only increases if you're queer and trans. And so yeah, I try to talk to them about that, but it gets a little I can talk to them about that, but my experience in the military is a little different, only because I served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell my whole time. And so I had to be completely under the radar and not out as queer and not out as trans. And so I had a little bit of a different experience, like cosplaying as straight, like cis and hetero. But I could see the writing on the wall if I had been, like more out and open with people about being queer and trans. And so I could tell them from that perspective of it's just not a welcoming, kind, gentle place and accepting place for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, just by the nature of it, of Don't Ask, Don't Tell being repealed, I don't even know, it's been 10 years yet. Even that in and of itself, that the things are not going to change that much for those folks. I hope that it would, but I can't imagine that it would in meaningful ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I served with a few folks that were gay and they had to, like you said, they had to be chameleons. They could not allow those aspects of their life to bleed over at all, especially if they wanted to have any kind of a career. That being in the military, you have to be a team player so much of the time, and by virtue of your sexual orientation, there will be people in there who will say that's not acceptable. And Giovanni, jump in here, man.
I'm saying you were a Marine as well, so I'm assuming that the culture is also a very, very toughened culture that you have to play that role every day. Because I grew up within the military as a military child, and I remember when the ask don't tell policy started on the Clinton. I remember my dad was in the military, having a dad used to have we'll have like good like get-togethers in people's house, and that we have a lot of people. And I remember people who were serving with my dad were gay, right? And they were operating. They were NCOs and whatnot, but they were known to be gay, among their circle of friends, but they were in the military pre Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was a little bit more, more, I guess, repressive than the Ask, Don't Tell period. I recall one person in particular, right? He became a good friend of the family. Actually, he became a good friend of my mom's, actually. And he was actually my dad's NCOIC supervisor, right? And he would come home and everything like that. But he had to marry a woman, right, to save his career. And then they had like these they had an arrangement, where she could do whatever and he can do whatever and whatnot, but they still had to be married, in the eyes of the military, right, in order for him to continue with his career and whatnot.
Yeah, I think, well, first I learned something new about you every time we we have a conversation. I didn't know you grew up with your dad being in the military. But yeah, it's one of those like prime examples of how changing a policy doesn't change the culture. And I think that you have to well, something I tell the youth and students I talk to is like the main purpose of the military is violence. And so anything that deviates from that is not going to be accepted. And so
Mm.
anything that's like, welcoming or inclusive and kind is not going to be accepted in the military as a whole. So like they're never going to change that aspect of the culture. They can change the policies, like who's allowed to contribute to that culture of violence, but they're not going to actually change the culture of violence in the military. So it's like before don't ask, don't tell. Okay, like, there's a long history of how queer and trans people have been included and not included in the military that we could get into some other time. But like before don't ask, don't tell is like, cool, like queer people, gay people, you get to be a part of this culture of violence. And then don't ask, don't tell happen. It's like, nope, actually, we're not going to let gay people be a part of our culture of violence. And now that that ban was removed, then they're like, okay, queer people, trans people, you can come back to being part of the violence. But it's never, the culture of violence never changes.
But I thought one of the things about Don't Ask, Don't Tell is because before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, when you're in your application, you were asked, you're asked two things. You were asked if you're homosexual, and you're asked if you are or ever been affiliated with the Communist Party or you're a communist. Those are two things that were really asked in your application when you joined the military. Prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. After Don't Ask, Don't Tell passed, then then that part wasn't allowed to be asked anymore. That's where the whole Don't Ask, Don't Tell came from. So people were being, before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, people were being put out of the military just on suspicions alone.
Yeah, I mean, I was also asked on my application if I smoked pot before. It's like,
Yeah, that was another question that was asked. Yeah,
it's just kind of like an understanding of, all right, we're just not going to talk about that.
yeah.
Yeah. I remember it was there was a time period. I was in the Marines from 2005 to 2012, and there was definitely a time period in there where it was like, it was a little, it was hairy. There was like, it was felt like a witch hunt, and people were being kicked out. And a lot of people went back, in the closet under the rocks. Because it's scary to think of. So I was deployed within a year of finishing all my training. And, to think that, oh my gosh, like all these benefits that I put blood, sweat, and tears into could be taken away from me, and it would all be for nothing. That was a very scary situation to be up against, and it'll make you just like turn into Judas and start denying a bunch of things. Yeah, it was a very, very uncomfortable, painful time for a lot of people.
Yeah, Manisha. So let's shift to Manisha real quick. Same question to you, Manisha. What are you most passionate about in the anti-war movement? What do you think about the anti-war movement too?
Well, first of all, hi everybody. My name's Monisha, she, they. It's really great to be here with the three of you. So I think talking about what I'm passionate about with the anti-war movement, I'll definitely be adding what I think of it. I started off with a focus on exposing the psychological warfare industry. The American Psychological Association. I started off working with something that Shiloh mentioned, military sexual violence, primarily from the standpoint of the non-enlisted victims or targets in conflict populations. For them, by way of the peace movement, trying to get some focus and attention on those two things. And I think the overall thing that attracted me to the anti-war movement or the pro-peace movement was the idea of justice, the sense of responsibility that, you know, as a collective we have, being part of the military of the Imperial Corps that is doing the most damage in the world right now. For that, and over time, my focus has shifted on the different, I guess, aspects of militarism and imperialism, trying to educate and inform in various ways to enhance the work of the anti-war movement, working a lot with Giovanni on hybrid warfare, education. And yeah, I mean, I'm also Puerto Rican, and so I'm very anti-colonial in my anti-war work, which is not something that is common, unfortunately, in the anti-war movement. Same with anti-imperialism. I guess maybe I'll say there are some pieces of anti-imperialism there, but I don't know that it's necessarily reached the breadth and the depth that it needs to. Or that would be ideal for actually achieving the goal. So yeah, those are the things that I like to work on. I like to work at the intersections of these oppressive systems that are manifested through the US military. And I was really appreciating to what Shiloh was talking about with the importance of that loving, nurturing anti-war work. Because that, I think, is also an element that is missing from the mainstream anti-war movement. So I really just want to applaud you, Shiloh, and give you my appreciation for the way that you approach counter recruitment. That's awesome. And I do some counter recruitment too. I worked with kiddos for a little bit and then shifted over to adults, recognizing that, you know, recruitment happens in colleges, recruitment happens in job fairs, recruitment happens in professional associations. I got stories about the American Psychological Association and the way that the military controls that industry. It is a defense industry. So yeah, I think that's probably my answer. Was there anything else that you think I should mention?
You said earlier when you started, you said anti-war movement, and then you shift rapidly to pro-peace movement. You know, is there a difference in your mind?
I think sometimes, yeah, because people have different ideas of how peace is achieved, and some people believe in just war, and some people think that some wars are acceptable. And so they say they're for peace, but they are not exactly anti-war. And then there are people who are anti-war, who take that label onto themselves, but their connection to what peace actually looks like for people is not necessarily there. So there's an absence of like justice work. There's an absence of taking steps toward building a culture of peace, which cannot always be done via yelling and screaming at protests. You know, those are an essential element of resistance, of course, but that's not how you create a culture of peace necessarily. So that's why I differentiate, because I think it's more of a spectrum, kind of like gender. I think that the positions one takes politically as it relates to US military activity in the world varies so much. So, yeah.
You mentioned how psychology is used in warfare. I remember during our training for deployment, during the so-called war on terror and everything, we were given booklets. Booklets. It was supposed to be and it was part of our training, actually. You know, different trainings and whatnot. It was created by psychologists. It's supposed to be to like trying to understand, the Middle East and the Middle Eastern mind and the Middle Eastern, person and whatnot. And that was supposed to be like part of our smart books, smart books meaning books that you keep, it's supposed to be like your quick reference type of books and whatnot. Included like phrases and, included like behaviors, typical of the Arab man and etc. You ever seen any of those books? You seen any of those books, Charlotte?
Yeah, and the Marines were issued them they were like many folded things that you're supposed to stick in your breast pocket and pull out. And it was like just treat humans as humans. I don't know. But it wasn't that. They weren't talking about that in the books. Yeah, I do remember those.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me that, to this day is about when they were trying to give us a reference of the Arab man, what the behavior and the character traits and whatnot is, and I mean it was very, very blunt and racist, in the sense that they'll say something like, Arab man would lie to save face or whatnot like that, and that's one of the things. I mean, what the hell, they would lie to save face. It's one of the things that stood out to me when I first approached that book, when I first saw it. Any thoughts, Manisha?
I mean, so would a US politician. No, but yeah, I mean, that's a great example of how embedded the field of psychology is. Psychology is, it's pretty much at least the industry is like the elite version of the study of human behavior, which also exists in other cultures throughout time, so it makes total sense, especially considering how necessary psychological warfare is to the success of the US government's goal of how it uses its military and what its overall what it hopes to achieve through military force. So yeah.
Thing is, these references that, you read them, you look at them, right, and you look at them with a sober mind, and know what you know now and everything. They're very, very juvenile. The way they describe the Middle East and the way they describe the Arab people and whatnot and Middle Eastern people and so forth, very juvenile. And then you think about it, these are references written by people with doctorate degrees.
It shows how demeaning and dehumanizing the field of psychology really is, depending on who's using it and why.
And you're a psychologist, right?
Yeah. I have one of those doctoral. That's how I know. It's funny because during school, so like I was a very angry homeless veteran when I started my doctoral program out of necessity, like the same reason why I enlisted, why at 17 years old, I succumbed to the recruitment that had been going on for 2 years prior of me as a child in school, because I wanted out of poverty and I wanted access to education. And I had always wanted to go as far as I could go with school, as far as I could afford to go with school. And when the opportunity came to go beyond, because prior to that, I had my bachelor's and master's in social work, and I was really trying to address the social issues that led me to think going in the military was the way of fighting, in air quotes, to resolve those social issues. So I thought, well, that obviously was not the answer. Maybe this way is the answer, like becoming a therapist. So when I started my doctoral degree, I was actually a licensed therapist, homeless, like a practicing licensed therapist who could not afford to live, and ended up in a homeless program with the Veterans Hospital near where I was working. And that whole entire experience, coupled with being confronted at my university, because I was studying humanistic psychology, which aligned more with the values of social work, which are supposed to be humanizing, although how those values are interpreted and implemented by capitalism are not humanizing. So I was confronted by peace activists in my program. And as a veteran specifically, they came for me and they were like, do you have any clue at all of what the system is that you are involved in and that is paying your way through school? Are you aware? And thankfully, their confrontation, that way I was able to kind of like shed a lot of the scales from my eyes, you know, of the mythology that we're taught about the US and the military. And that's when I was confronted by like some really harsh realities that no recruiter is going to tell anybody, that the US media is not going to tell anybody. And also was confronted by our own history, you know, of Puerto Rico, of Vieques. My family comes from Vieques, Puerto Rico, which was used for war games, similar to Jeju Island, similar to many locations like the Diné, who are struggling from the impacts of weapons testing and mining for uranium and their reservations. You know, all of that flew in my face. And then that's when I, thanks to going to a school of psychology with peace activist psychologists, like was able to come to terms with some things, deal with some moral injury, and redirect my path, really redirect my focus of my work and commit to what I hope will at least help in the quest for you know, justice and peace.
Awesome. How about you, Shiloh? What has been your journey since the time you left, you shedded the Marine Corps uniform and end up where you're at now?
Whoa, how long do we have? Yeah, what a path. I think like a lot of veterans, I got out of the Marine Corps and wanted nothing to do with military veterans. If I smelled that you're a veteran, I ran the other direction. Never wanted to admit to it for myself for a long time. I think that would have been true if I was cisgender and hetero, but especially because I'm queer and trans, the two seem in such opposition to one another. To be queer and trans and a veteran, that was at least my perception at the time, because I served under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I didn't know other queer and trans people in the military. And so I very much felt like, am I the only one? Okay, I need to deny that part of myself to be accepted into queer and trans spaces and circles. And then I think there was like a reckoning within myself, kind of like Monisha was talking about, where you have to like look in the mirror and be presented with all the things that you're a part of, no matter what the circumstances were that put you in that position. Like, yeah, I was a part of this, and I need to reckon with that and very much be on a path of healing from that, so that I can do the work of talking, you know, very truthfully and honestly with others about my experience. I think if you haven't come to that reckoning and that healing part, it just comes out when you try to talk to others, you know, like it's not as believable. And yeah, I was a teacher for many years, and I think that kind of melding the two, like I love children, I love learning with them, and so how can I like do kind of these two things that I love at the same time, like talking to students, being with students honestly, transparently, and that means talking until they're done hearing it from me about about my experience in the Marine Corps and my experience as a trans veteran. Yeah.
I think that's probably a pretty good spot for us to wrap up our conversation here. Thank you both for sharing some of your experiences with us and talking about what you're passionate about, how you came to where you are today. I know in the future, hopefully, that we'll do excuse me, individual episode 0 recordings with you guys, and we can talk a little more specifically about, how you got in the military and what are the things that you carry with you, wittingly or unwittingly, that people need to know about. They need to understand what the real burden of being in the military is, and and how we end up telling that story to everyone else. So, Giovanni, do you have anything else you wanted to add, man?
No, it's an awesome conversation. I feel I got to know both of you a little bit more. I worked with both of you in the past for quite some time, but I appreciate you opening up and sharing this part of your life that I didn't know.
Yeah, I really look forward to the more in depth. I have so many questions for you, Monisha. Could talk to you forever. Yeah.
And to everybody listening at home, thank you for joining us today at Fortress on a Hill. Well, you'll hear from us again soon. Take care.
Peace.
Money is tight these days for everyone, especially in the lingering shadow of COVID. Penny pinching to make it through the month often doesn't give people the funds to contribute to a creator they support. So we consider it the highest honor that folks help us fund the podcast in any dollar amount they're able. Patreons is the main place to do that, and for supporters who can donate $10 a month or more, they will be listed right here as an honorary producer, like these fine folks. Fahim's Everyone Dream, James O'Barr, James Higgins, Eric Phillips, Paul Appel, Julie Dupree, Thomas Benson, Janet Hanson, Daniel Fleming, Michael Karen, Ren Jacob, Rick Coffey, Scott Spalding, Spooky Tooth, and the Status Quo podcast. However, if Patreon isn't your style, you can contribute directly through PayPal at paypal.me/Fortress on a Hill. Or please check out our store on Spreadshirt for some great Fortress merch. We're on Twitter and on Facebook.com/Fortress on a Hill. You can find our full collection of episodes at www.fortressonahill.com. Skepticism is one's best armor. Never forget it. We'll see you next time.
Come on, you good people, and listen to my song. I hope you'll pay attention. I will not